Hi, I'm Natasha Sinyanovich, and this is Women Like Sex, a myth-busting podcast that examines the many, many medical, scientific, and social facts about female sexuality that were never, in fact, facts, especially the very modern-day belief that women don't like sex as much as men do. I'll be speaking with experts, educators, friends, comedians, and more across a spectrum of ages, genders, and cultures to flip the scripts on myths and misconceptions that have long been dictated by not women. Together, we'll replace so much inaccurate messaging with healthier, smarter, factual facts and get the sex ed we wish we'd gotten. Welcome to Getting On and Getting Off, the first ever Women Like Sex mini-series. I conducted most of Go-Go's interviews for This Is Nashville, the daily show of my former station, Nashville Public Radio. Earlier this year, I was brought on to help produce their series Next Stage on aging and intimacy. But so much material didn't make it into that show, so I'm using it for my own look at aging and sex, sexuality, even menopause. And, of course, the massive myth that as we get on with life, we must get off less. But why should sex get worse with age? I mean, 10,000 hours, first of all. As we become more comfortable with and aware of our bodies, desires, and pleasure, sexual satisfaction increases. With some clauses. First, human bodies can't do everything at 58 or 88 that they could at 28. But spoiler alert, the biggest predictors of happy, healthy, sexy time at every age are 1, communication, and 2, expanding beyond just the P and V, penis and vagina model, which leaves straight women having less orgasms than basically everyone else on the planet. Go-Go's first guest is Dr. Justin Lehmiller, a social psychologist and senior research fellow at the Kinsey Institute, one of the world's leading research centers on sex, gender, and reproduction. Justin is also host of the Sex and Psychology podcast, and I recently discovered sexology research trips abroad that I might just join one day. Among other topics, we discuss his research on sexual fantasies and how older men fantasize more about romance than older women, who, however, are more sexually satisfied. Justin also shares his findings on the importance of masturbating for menopause and why we need to stop scaring women about this transition, especially when so many enjoy it for the pregnancy-free sexy time. Justin also reminded me of the enraging fact that U.S. medical schools still only tend to spend 10 hours on sex ed across the entire 4 years. So sure, we've come a long way, baby, but have so much further to go to helping all of us understand our most intimate selves. Links to his research and other people and resources we discuss can be found in the transcript of this episode via the womenlikesex.com episodes page. Last but not least, to help keep this fully independent, no-string budget podcast going, please consider supporting it at the level of your choice at patreon.com/womenlikesex. Thank you. Let's just jump right in with desire and fantasies and what you have found from your studies about, actually, women and men, but I think most of your studies have been, or the ones you sent me have been on women. What have you found in terms of women's fantasies as they get older?
So I've studied the sexual fantasies of more than 10,000 people from all around the world. And I find that there are lots of commonalities in terms of what men and women fantasize about, but there are some differences. But I find that there are really interesting patterns and trajectories in our fantasies as we age. And if we're talking specifically about women, one of the key things I see is that for younger women in particular, women in, say, their 20s and early 30s, there's a much higher prevalence of fantasies around kink and BDSM. There is also more fantasies around things like passion and romance, right? Now, if we sort of progress a little bit in time to midlife, one of the things that we see there is that the kink fantasies start to decrease, but we see an increase in other types of fantasies. Specifically, there tend to be more fantasies around sex with multiple partners or exploring some type of non-monogamy, or just trying something new and different in the bedroom. And if you progress beyond that and you're looking at sort of postmenopausal women, what we see is a general decline in most types of fantasies across the board. And in terms of what explains or accounts for these differences, these sort of ebbs and flows in fantasies over time, it's really a biopsychosocial phenomenon, right? So for menopausal women, where fantasies tend to decline, that's largely driven by hormones, right? So hormones play a big role in terms of whether or not we fantasize, right? Because they stimulate sexual arousal. And one of the things that I've seen in my own work is that for women who are postmenopausal, who are on hormone replacement therapy, they actually have more fantasies on average than women who are not taking a hormone replacement, right? So our hormones are part of what play a role here. But in terms of why at midlife women's fantasies become more adventuresome, well, midlife is an interesting period of time, right? There's a lot of things happening. And at midlife, for example, many people develop more confidence in themselves and ability to ask for what they want, and they stop caring as much about what other people think, right? So there's a certain sort of freedom or liberation that can happen around this period of time. There's also often the realization that, I only have so much time left, so I want to make the most of it, right? Which can also prompt people to want to try new and different things. But also midlife is this really big transitional period where many people, for example, were in long-term relationships and now they're divorced or they're ending them, or they've just started a new relationship. And maybe they're changing the way that they approach relationships, and maybe they're approaching it more on their own terms than they were in the past, right? So there can be a lot of things happening at midlife. And then lastly, for the younger women, in terms of why there are those greater fantasies about kink and BDSM, I think there's a sociocultural explanation for that in terms of, kink is something that has become very mainstream in recent years in the media and in pornography. And that does seem to be shaping ideas and expectations around sex for young men and women, and is part of the reason why kink is becoming a bigger part of their fantasies.
Yeah, I saw looking at the studies and the results and the conclusions that kink and BDSM fantasies decline with age, but also that the people interviewed hadn't really wanted it before
Yep.
to begin with.
Right. And that's very telling, right? For the fact that, older women are saying they've never fantasized about kink or BDSM. I think there's definitely a generational component here, a difference in terms of just sort of our exposure to kink and how that creeps in and shapes and affects our sexual fantasies.
So I want to ask you about men as well, but before I do that, before I forget, what does erotic flexibility mean? Because that seemed to be the only one on the charts where women over 60, like it increased for women over 60.
Mhm.
What does that mean? I'm assuming that's not like physical flexibility.
Right. Yeah. So when I was talking about erotic flexibility there, it was really more in terms of your sexual orientation, in terms of how willing you are to sort of push the boundaries of that. So, for example, a heterosexually identified person having a same sex fantasy and sort of exploring something that's new and different. And there's actually been a lot that's been said and written in the popular media recently about late in life lesbians and women who are coming out and exploring their sexuality for the first time later in life. So, that might be part of what's behind that particular pattern.
And what about men? What about male fantasies as they get older?
So I see a similar pattern for men where there's this peak in sexual adventuresomeness at midlife, right? Where you've got more fantasies about novelty, multiple partners, non monogamy, but also more fantasies about doing things that are taboo or forbidden, right? So it's just sort of across the board. All of those fantasies kind of seem to be increasing at that midlife era. And also for older men, you do tend to see a drop off in most types of fantasies across the board. And that may also be due to, older men having changes in their hormones, and that's going to influence their sexual fantasies. It's not to say that older adults never fantasize. They just tend to fantasize less on average about most things. But there was one interesting thing in my data with older men where I saw that, across most age brackets that I was looking at, women on average were fantasizing about passion and romance more than men. But for the older men, they were actually fantasizing about passion and romance more than older women were, right? And I think that that might reflect sort of changing meanings and understandings of what sex is as men and women age, and how it might come to represent something different for men, where maybe sometimes there's this shift toward sex as intimacy as opposed to sex as penetration. And something else we see in the research more broadly is that for older adults, where you do have that shift towards sex as intimacy, they tend to report more satisfying sex lives because it puts more options on the menu.
Which is what we should be doing all along, right? Not thinking of
Right.
sex as just P and V.
Exactly.
I mean, that excludes anyone who's not hetero, but it also, but for women, that's not, the V isn't where we get most of our pleasure anyway.
Hmm.
The nerve endings aren't there. Um, and I did also want to talk to you about, I know I mentioned we have this narrative of menopause equals decline. Everything gets worse. And it scares a lot of women.
Hmm.
Like, yes, some things have changed and hot flashes aren't fun. Although I just spoke to Karen Beale yesterday, who
Hmm.
quoted Betsy Dotson on, you can think of them as heat orgasms, which I like. Has this narrative always been, or from my perspective, it's always been negative because it's also been associated with, well, if you can't reproduce, then what good are you as a woman?
Hmm.
Then so many of your sort of social functions, your function for humanity. But how has this narrative changed? And has it changed? Have you seen changes for the better? Have you seen changes for the worse?
Hmm.
How is the media helping or hurting these narratives or creating them?
Yeah. So when it comes to cultural views on menopause, I think it's important to first recognize that they do vary cross culturally, right? And so the way people view and think about it might differ from one country to another. But in the US, views have largely been negative for a long time. And I think it's because menopause was this really taboo subject that no one really wanted to talk about. And if it did get talked about, the only thing you ever heard about was hot flashes or other symptoms or problems that might happen as a result of menopause. And, the fact that menopause is not covered as part of sex education or anywhere else means that most people don't know a whole lot about it, right? So, we actually did a survey 2 years ago at the Kinsey Institute in partnership with the sexual wellness brand Womanizer. And one of the things that we looked at were just sort of what is the average person's knowledge about menopause in terms of what are the actual common symptoms? What is the age at which it tends to happen on average? Do they even know what the definition of menopause is? Right. And so we had this short quiz and we found that hardly anyone got all the questions right, right? Most people got like a question or two right, but the vast majority of them were missing most of these questions.
How many questions were there when you say one or two?
So there were only like 6 or 7 or so questions on this survey. It was a very short survey, but even the very basic question of what is menopause, lots of people didn't even get that one right, right? And so that just goes to show that we're not teaching people what they need to know about it. We also asked women in this survey whether or not their doctor had ever talked to them about menopause. And, a shockingly high number of them said that their doctor hadn't even brought it up before, right? So if it's not even being addressed in healthcare and medical settings, like that's also telling of the fact that just culturally, so many of us are just kind of ignorant of this issue. And so I think we've seen a shift in the last few years where menopause has finally started to be talked about more openly in the media. The New York Times and other outlets, for example, have done these big pieces on menopause in recent years, which I think have done a lot to start to change the narrative and to increase public understanding. And, I think that has been beneficial. Prior to a couple of years ago, I think a lot of people didn't even know what the term perimenopause meant, right? They'd only ever heard the term menopause before. But, there's this whole period up to a decade in some cases before the menopause transition where periods start to become irregular and you might start to experience various symptoms of menopause. And so, I think we're moving in the right direction, but we still have our work cut out for us.
What are some countries and cultures that have a positive or more positive view of menopause?
So, one of the examples that I've seen most often is in terms of Japan, in terms of how women there view menopause. And it's really seen more as a life transition as opposed to a medical condition. And interestingly, in some of the research that looks at menopause through this cross cultural lens, you see that in countries where menopause is not medicalized so much, women aren't reporting the same sorts of symptoms as women in other countries, right? So just sort of that cultural understanding of menopause might also play a role in terms of how it's experienced and what is labeled or identified as a symptom and how distressing it might be.
Yeah, I find this among female peri and menopausal and postmenopausal friends who, anytime they're a little bit distracted or stressed or it's brain fog, it's menopause. I'm like, well, how do
Mhm.
you know? We're not doctors. We're just sitting around having coffee. How do we quantify this? And I've seen that used negatively to be like, oh, well, it's got to be menopause in the same way as I wrote, like, oh, she's on her period. Like if there's anything emotional, it's a way to dismiss people.
Yeah, and I think we've seen something happen in recent years where, these terms sort of become these catch-alls, right? There's a parallel here to something with, say, ADHD, where almost any behavior in young boys that involves distractibility or excitability gets labeled or categorized as ADHD. And so it's very overdiagnosed. And, we see something similar happen with perimenopause and menopause, where almost anything you can think of sometimes gets labeled or attributed to that. And you're right, it may or may not be part of it. But I do think it's important to recognize that when it comes to menopause, the umbrella of symptoms that might fall under that is much bigger than what most people think, because the media has led us to believe that it's just about hot flashes, when in reality, there can be a lot of other things going on. And one of the big ones is that during menopause, sleep difficulties become much more pronounced. I forget what the exact number is off the top of my head, but it's somewhere around a third of or more of menopausal women who actually would meet criteria for insomnia, right? Which tells us, how big of an issue sleep becomes for menopausal women. And when you have disrupted sleep, that can lead to a whole range of other symptoms, including concentration difficulties or brain fog. But sleep is just so important in general that when it becomes disrupted, that can also impair sexual function, right? So there can be a lot of downstream effects just from something as simple as not getting as much sleep as you were before, or having less restful sleep.
Another big one is vaginal dryness. And I'm curious as to when we say vaginal dryness, it's a two-part question, really. What do we mean? And is it connected only to sex, to penetration? Because I've had OBGYNs and my GPs tell me, well, just expect vaginal dryness with sex. And that to me also speaks to a larger, well, you're assuming I'm straight, and you're assuming I'm hetero, and you're also assuming that that's the only way to have sex. Like that is, again, that's a very narrow definition of sex. Do, for example, lesbians and bi women, are there studies that have found that there are the same amounts of, the same sort of complaints of or findings of vaginal dryness?
I have a lot of thoughts on this question, right? So, the fact that the only things we tend to hear about menopause are that there are hot flashes, vaginal dryness, or other problems. That's why so many people are just sort of scared of menopause to begin with, is because they only ever hear about problems or negative issues. And in reality, there are lots of women who report positive changes or benefits as a result of going through menopause, right? So, a couple of examples in terms of things in our surveys that women have said either they're looking forward to or they appreciate now because they're menopausal would be not having periods anymore, right? That can be a benefit, right? And being able to have sex without the concern or fear of unintended pregnancy, that can actually make sex more liberating for older women. And there can be other benefits of it as well, but those are just a few examples. Now, in terms of that question of vaginal dryness, yes, that can happen to women regardless of their sexuality or sexual orientation. It's just something that I think tends to be a bit more pronounced for heterosexual women, because many of them are only approaching sex through the lens of vaginal penetration, where vaginal dryness is going to be more of an issue, right? So the vagina is naturally self-lubricating. Like during sexual arousal, it releases its own lubrication. But as you get older, as your hormone levels decline, that can make it more difficult to produce more of that uh, lubrication. And so there are different solutions for this. One is to spend more time on building up arousal, right? Because the more time you spend on foreplay building up arousal, the more that can help with vaginal lubrication. But it can also involve using an artificial lubricant, right? And that's another way to sort of supplement the body's natural lubrication. And there are an increasing number of lubes that are being put out there now that are designed specifically for menopausal women, and also sex toys that are designed more for menopausal women as well. So I'm glad to see that conversations around this are changing, and that companies are investing more in products that are designed to help menopausal women to maintain and have satisfying, happy, and healthy sex lives. Because just because menopause happens, that doesn't mean sex has to go away or that it has to become worse in some way.
My understanding then from what you're saying is vaginal dryness pretty much only refers to penetration, or can it just happen when it just becomes dry and it affects your ability to sit and stand and walk?
Yeah, so it varies from woman to woman, right? So vaginal dryness and pain are sometimes during menopause only reported as issues during partnered sexual activity. But other times there can be pain or dryness or other issues that happen that affect you at other times during the day as well, right? And so this is part of why hormone replacement therapy is often recommended for menopausal women, because it helps in treating a lot of those underlying symptoms, right? And so, and actually, what the research shows is that the earlier women start on hormone replacement therapy, the better in terms of their outcomes. And it's important to recognize that there are different types of hormonal options that are out there. There are the systemic hormones that you take that course through your whole body. And then there's also the local or topically applied hormones that are only applied in the genital area. And, figuring out the best solution for you necessitates having a conversation with your healthcare provider about that. But hormones are much safer than people think they are. This is another area where, there's been a lot of misinformation. Back in the early 2000s, there were these medical trials that came out suggesting that hormonal replacement therapy drastically increased risk for cancer in menopausal women. And it turns out that those claims were very overstated, very overblown. And we now know that hormones are generally pretty safe and well tolerated. Not for everyone. Again, it involves consulting with your doctor to figure out the best solution for you. But the topical hormones can be a great option for people who might be concerned about the systemic type, because it's only applied locally to the genital area. And many women find that it's very helpful in terms of dealing with issues like genital pain, vaginal dryness, and so forth.
I can talk from personal experience that I was prescribed estradiol for vulvodynia, and then it turned out, and I found vulvodynia has nothing to do with hormones. It seems that at least 20% of women is a neurological thing that in my case may have been caused from a car accident. So,
it turns out that for women with genital pain disorders, on average, it takes about 7 years to get an accurate diagnosis, right? And that's also really telling of how inadequate and insufficient medical training is in terms of sexuality related issues. The stat that I've seen is that on average in medical school, doctors are getting about 10 hours of sex education across those 4 years of med school, right? That's like 2.5 hours per year. And that's where they're expected to learn everything they need to know about STIs and sexual dysfunctions and, all these other sorts of issues. And it's just totally, completely inadequate. And that's where we really need to train doctors differently, and they need a lot more sexual health training, because your sexual health is so important to your overall health and well-being.
And also, most people they're going to see are going to be having sex.
Mm-hmm.
Most people they see are going to be having sex, so they should be better schooled. To go back to, and you just said the name of it, and I've forgotten the company with whom Womanizer, yes, partnered. Yes. Tell me about masturbation and how that can affect menopause. I don't even like to say symptoms, because that makes it that pathologizes it. Just menopause issues, factors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Womanizer was interested in better understanding factors that might be helpful to menopausal women. And so they approached us at the Kinsey Institute on partnering on, at first, the survey, just to sort of look at, well, how many menopausal women are masturbating? What are their experiences like? And how is it affecting any issues that they might be experiencing? And so we did a nationally representative US survey, and we found that for about a third of the women we surveyed, they had noticed that masturbation positively affected at least one negative issue that they were experiencing as a result of menopause. And most commonly, those issues centered around sleep difficulties, or concentration difficulties, mood disturbances, and so forth. But for basically every menopausal symptom we asked about, we had at least some participants who had noticed improvement on it. And so this led us to do a follow-up intervention study where we followed a series of, I believe it was 66 peri and postmenopausal women over a period of 3 months, where they went through an abstinence phase, followed by a masturbate with your preferred method phase, followed by a masturbate with a womanizer clitoral sex toy phase, just to sort of look at how do symptoms change based on whether women are masturbating or not and how often they're doing it. And what we found was that for women who were engaged in masturbation, whether with their usual method or with using a toy, they were reporting fewer symptoms across the board. Again, most commonly, the symptoms that were affected the most pronounced symptoms that were affected were the sleep difficulties, the mood changes, and so forth. And I think that makes sense, right? Because masturbation, particularly to the point of orgasm, can help people to fall asleep, right? It's something a lot of people actually do intentionally at night before they go to bed, because research shows that it reduces sleep latency, right? So the amount of time it takes for you to fall asleep. And then it also helps you to fall asleep longer and sleep more soundly and deeply. So it makes sense that, I think a lot of these women were experiencing general improvements in symptoms simply in part by just having better sleep.
And in terms of general improvements, I did see some of your findings found that, the quality of sex and the quality of orgasms did not decline as women got older. They either stayed the same or improved.
Mhm.
What about men? Erectile dysfunction is a big thing, and I spoke a couple weeks ago with Greg Lewis and his partner on the Kinsey study, Carol. I'm blanking on her name now, in Zurich at the Sexocorporeal Institute, where they lost participants because when they started processing unprocessed trauma, they no longer needed sildenafil. Is that how you pronounce
Sildenafil, yep.
sildenafil? Okay, I keep
Mhm.
just calling it Viagra for. Have you studied men also in terms of as they get older, 50, 60 and older, in terms of their sexual and orgasmic quality,
Yeah.
orgasm qualities?
Yeah. So, just one other thing I'll say about women before we move on to men in terms of sex and aging is that, there's this perception more broadly that sexual function declines or diminishes necessarily with age, right? This idea that sex is going to get worse. But our research really runs counter to that. We find that for many peri and postmenopausal women, they're reporting having the best and most orgasms that they've had in their life, right? Now, it's not that case across the board. Again, some people are reporting no change, some people are reporting improvements, some people are reporting declines. But I think it's just an important point that sexual declines are not an inevitable outcome, and sex sometimes actually gets better with age. Now, in terms of older men, in terms of their sexual function, one of the things that we tend to see on average in the research is that older women, on average, actually tend to be more sexually satisfied than older men. Right. And I think part of what accounts for that is that men's and women's bodies might be changing and moving in somewhat different directions. Right. And so some of these distinct sort of biological changes could be part of the story there. There can also be differences in terms of whether they're getting hormonal support, in terms of how that affects their sexual function. And we know that, for men in particular, erectile dysfunction, the risk of it increases by about, I think, 10% with every decade of life, right? So as you're getting up into, the 60s, the 70s, and so forth, you have this very high prevalence of erectile difficulties. And many men are too embarrassed, afraid, ashamed to talk to the doctor about it, right? And so they don't end up getting help or treatment for it, which is part of why you have a lot of older men who are reporting very negative implications for their sex lives. It's because they're just too embarrassed, too uncomfortable to go seek treatment for it.
And I imagine for heterosexual men or heterosexual partnered men that can also cause the quality of sex to decline for women because we focus so much on P and V
Hmm.
as opposed to, well, there are other things you can be doing.
Yep. And it goes back to that idea of how does your definition of sex evolve or change with age? And what we see in the research is that for older adults who retain this very strict view or definition of sex as penis and vagina intercourse, they're much less sexually satisfied than those who shift to a view of sex as intimacy instead of sex as penetration. And so, yeah, but that's an issue that's true for both men and women. Like the more strict that you are with your definition of sex, the more that actually can harm and undermine your sex life.
Yeah, that's what I keep telling people. Like, if you keep thinking of the vagina as the female sex organ, then how do you know? How to broaden your. Well, I'm preaching to the choir.
Right.
You know much more about all of this than I do. Can masturbation? Have there been studies shown that masturbation can improve hormonal changes for men as well? We don't. I mean, is it andropause? What is
Mhm.
the counterpart to menopause?
Yeah. So andropause is the sort of male counterpart to it. It's different from menopause, right? Because menopause is an abrupt shut off of sex hormone production. Yes, you have the perimenopause period where you're having these disruptions in hormones. And again, that can last from, months to several years. But andropause is something that's much more gradual, so there's not that abrupt change or shut off. And so the effects of it aren't necessarily, overnight or as, dramatic in that way. But we do know that that does have big implications for men's sexual health and function. That's part of why testosterone replacement is sort of all the rage in advertising and media these days, is because, we realize what an important role it plays in sexual health and function. So for older men, can masturbation help with andropause? I don't know that I would make a prediction there on that, because I think it's just yeah, I haven't really thought about it. So I'm not sure if I would make the same parallel prediction, but I'll have to do the study to actually know the answer.
What is the takeaway? What would you like people who are aging and wanting to continue or still continuing or afraid that they're not going to be able to continue with sexy time? What's the message that you would like for them to have?
So I think one of the things I'd like to say is that, and this is a piece of advice that comes from my friend Joan Price, who is a sex educator for seniors who writes wonderful books on this topic. For anyone who's wanting to learn more about this, I highly recommend Joan's work. But one of the things that she finds, this is the most common sexual complaint among seniors and older adults, is that the old ways don't work anymore, right? And there's a lot of truth to this, right? Because the way that we approach sex when we were younger might not work for our bodies as we age, right? It might be less comfortable. It might not be practical or feasible. It might be painful. So what feels good to us now might be different than it did then. And that's okay, right? I think the problem when it comes to approaching sex as we get older is that many of us are just trying to do the same exact thing that we were doing in the same way when we were 20 or 30, and that just doesn't work for us anymore. So having this idea that sex isn't just one thing and it wasn't just what you were doing in the past, but that it can be evolving and adaptable to your body, your partner's body, and your current circumstances, that just, again, gives you so many more options and ways to seek pleasure and fulfillment. So yeah, the sex that you're having now might not look like it used to, but that's okay. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's any less pleasurable or satisfying.
A big thank you to Justin Lehmiller, social psychologist, senior research fellow at the Kinsey Institute, and host of the Sex and Psychology podcast. You can find links to his socials, people and research we discussed, and the transcript of this conversation at womenliksex.com/episodes. Women Like Sex is a flipped script production. It is executive produced and edited by me, Natasha Sinyanovich. Website design and artwork are by Ted Nunes. Edesio Martinez is associate producer. For more episodes and swag, or to subscribe to the podcast or Patreon, please visit womenlikesex.com, the Women Like Sex YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is Women Like Sex. Pass it on.